Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm joined today by my co-host,
Jonathan Edens. I'm a psychiatric PA.
All right, today we are going to be talking about major depressive disorder, which is something that is very prevalent. We're going to get into some of the stats later on, and we're also going to talk about some of the root causes behind depression and also the definition. And so I think it's going to be a very informative podcast for our listeners. But I wanted to start with a quote from an author, Elizabeth Wurtzel, and she wrote about depression. That's the thing about depression. A human being can survive almost anything as long as they see the end in sight. But depression is so insidious, and it compounds daily, making it impossible to ever see the end. That fog is like a cage without a key. And so I like that quote because I think it does encompass a lot of what people often feel, kind of this sense of, I really need to get out of this. I want to get out of this, but I'm in this fog. I feel stuck. I'm hopeless. I don't know how to get out of it. And I don't know about you, Jonathan, but when you're talking to somebody and you're first meeting them, they're struggling with depression, that can be a really difficult thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially for family members that maybe have never dealt with clinical depression, a lot of times we get this whole just pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? And if you've never been through it yourself, I think this particular quote can kind of show you just how confusing, this sort of lack of direction, this lack of really nowhere where to go, right?
Absolutely. And one thing that I've thought about is with that whole idea of the key and not having the key, not knowing where to place it, is kind of like what we want to help people understand in their journey of depression is okay, you may not have the key, but there are other people that maybe do have at least part of the key, or at least can guide you to where to put that key. So there is hope. And I think that's a really important part when we're dealing with depression, right? Is coming alongside people, not shaming them, but realizing, okay, we want to work on this together and there is a way out, but just don't try to do it all by yourself.
Absolutely.
So when you think about depression, I mean, a lot of people think about a real sense of loss too. And, it's not always related to what we might think about as a classic loss, like a death or something like that. But it can certainly be related even to a sense of loss of identity or a loss of physical health. But at its core, there really is a sense of loss and even of the mental well-being and peace that maybe I had before.
Now, I might even add a couple more in there, but a loss of control, right, can be a really big problem for a lot of people, or a loss of youth and or innocence. You think about people with sexual trauma, that can cause significant depression because they feel like something has been taken from them, or maybe the loss of a future. And I don't mean that they don't have a future, but their perception of what their future otherwise, what they originally thought it would be, and so that is stripped from them by something, and there's that hopelessness that sets in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely hear that from a lot of my patients, is just that sense of, like you said, being out of control and not knowing where to turn and just feeling lost. So let's talk a little bit about depression. What are we actually talking about when we talk about depression, and how do we define that? Is it just, I feel down, I feel depressed today, so then I have major depression?
Yeah, there's a colloquial use of a lot of different psychiatric disorders, right? And depression is maybe one of the most used, right? So when people say I feel depressed, that doesn't necessarily mean you have clinical depression. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of what the criteria are in order for people to really meet the criteria in order to get diagnosed with clinical depression. But just in general, when we're talking about regular depression, it's essentially just persistent low mood that impairs daily function to a significant degree.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, and I think one of the key words there, is persistent, right? Because we all have our days where we're like, I don't feel so great today. It's not like my favorite day. I wish I could have just gone back to bed, or maybe I can just skip till tomorrow. But that's not clinical major depression, right? It's that persistently low mood that doesn't go away day after day after day.
And the second kind of important phrase there is that it impairs daily function. And so, Dr. Binus, what does that mean when you're talking about daily functioning?
Yeah, I mean, that can mean quite a few, but basically we can't do our basic daily tasks like go to work, for example, or interact appropriately with our family. So it can impact us socially, or even our activities of daily living, like self-care, taking a shower, that sort of thing, or even cooking food for ourselves. So a lot of our patients that we deal with, they can struggle in one of these domains, or oftentimes several.
So major depression is classified as a mood disorder. And so mood disorder is an umbrella term. This includes things in addition to major depressive disorder, such as seasonal affective disorder, where you get depression mainly in the winters for most people, or persistent depressive disorder, or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is kind of like a heightened version of PMS, bipolar disorder, and cyclothymic disorder. So we're not going to go into all the different definitions of those, but just to show you, there's a collection of different mood disorders, and major depression is just one. So just saying I'm depressed doesn't mean you have major depression, because there's far more nuance than that.
That's very true. And that's why it's important, if someone is dealing with a significantly, persistently low mood for quite some time, to really get professional help, to get a full evaluation instead of just self-diagnosing, because mood disorders certainly are on a spectrum.
And one more point to make is that a major depression is a syndrome. And what we mean by that is a syndrome is essentially a collection of different symptoms, right? So symptoms are the expression, the characteristics associated with the disorder. And when you combine many of these things together, as a group, right, this can make up the diagnosis. And so one thing we want to emphasize is that because you're depressed, it just doesn't mean that you have major depressive disorder, as we said just a minute ago. But there's many other symptoms. Many people may not actually feel depressed, but they can still meet criteria for major depressive disorder because they check off enough of the other boxes.
That's right. And so in order to really figure out if someone meets criteria for major depression, we have to turn to the psychiatric Bible of sorts, which is the DSM. And the latest version is the DSM-5. And so, yeah, Jonathan, maybe you could talk a little bit about what are those criteria when we're actually looking at diagnosing major depressive disorder according to the DSM-5.
So there's 9 different criteria, and don't fall asleep on me, because we're going to go through these. We are going to go through them fairly quickly, but they're all important to know, especially if you feel like you may be dealing with major depression, or you have a family member that's dealing with it. Looking out for all of these things is going to be key. So one thing before we get started on the criteria is just the duration, right? So we kind of talked about persistent depressive mood, right? So typically we define an episode as lasting at least 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So if it's lasted 2 weeks or more, now that number is somewhat arbitrary, right? But it just goes to show that it can't be something that you feel for an afternoon, right? Or maybe only goes for a day or two with minimal impairment, right? That's not really clinical depression. It doesn't necessarily necessitate treatment because it's not severe enough to. So that's the first thing, is just duration. But in terms of the symptoms that the patients will tend to present with, so feeling sad, empty, hopeless for most of the day, nearly every day, right? That's the first and one of the most important. Now, the second, and also one of the most important, is having little interest or perceived pleasure in doing things that you would normally enjoy. There's a fancy term for this. It's called anhedonia. So in the diagnostic criteria, you have to have at least one of those symptoms in order to meet criteria. So you have to have the lack of interest or the depression and hopelessness.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because in symptom number 1, even there, it doesn't have to be depression. It can be a sense of emptiness, or sadness. Because a lot of people are like, well, what is depression? But they might feel empty and they might feel sad. And so that would definitely meet that.
So for symptom number 3, it's changes in sleep. So this could be either insomnia, not sleeping enough, or hypersomnia, sleeping too much. Symptom number 4 is feeling fatigued or having decreased energy levels throughout the day, and that's relative to baseline, right? A lot of people just have low energy. Maybe they have a medical condition, or maybe they're not really taking care of their health, just sort of in general. And so they have fatigue. But when you're depressed, this is above and beyond what one might normally feel. Symptom number 5 is going to be changes in your normal appetite or eating patterns. So this might be, maybe you go from eating 3 times a day, and maybe all of a sudden you've got a loss of appetite during certain portions of the day, but then maybe you've got increased appetite at other portions, and you kind of are all over the place. Or maybe you just have no appetite whatsoever, or maybe you're burying your feelings in food, right? So it can typically result in either weight gain or weight loss, or there's really drastic fluctuations in normal eating patterns.
Yeah, a lot of my patients, it seems like it's often all over the place, where some days it's this and that, and it really can wreak havoc on your whole body, really.
Absolutely. So symptom number 6 is going to be the feeling of excessive guilt, shame, or worthlessness. And this is one of those big ones that really causes the depression to spiral very quickly. When you are feeling this way, and you're not very motivated, so you're not getting a lot done, and then you feel guilty because of that, that only makes a lot of those symptoms all the more worse. And so this is a very important one to address a lot of times with patients. Symptom number 7, the decreased ability to concentrate, or being abnormally indecisive. So concentration is a big thing in terms of your day-to-day functionality, right? It's going to be very difficult, especially if you have like a really technical type job, to perform at your best if you can't concentrate. For a lot of people with depression, maybe they have a lot of racing thoughts, or maybe their mind's like completely blank, or maybe they just have a lot of like a weightiness and a fog to their mind, right? These things can significantly impact concentration.
Oh yeah. And some people will ruminate a lot, where they, those intrusive negative thoughts, and actually, that previous symptom you talked about with the inappropriate guilt can really often impair concentration, right?
So Dr. Binus, would you like to describe symptom number 8 for us?
Sure. So that can be a little tricky to understand sometimes, but basically it has to do with either what we call psychomotor agitation or psychomotor retardation. And what we mean by that is a sense of restlessness is the psychomotor agitation, where some people that are depressed, it will manifest itself in the body, and they feel like they really can't sit still. They're agitated, and a lot of times they move more than usual, and they just feel that sense of dis-ease. And the other is basically the opposite, psychomotor retardation, which basically means they're just way more inactive than usual. They're not moving as much. They're just withdrawn and kind of blankly staring. And we can see the case. What I would say is, a lot of times I've noticed psychomotor agitation tends to take place more with the anxious type depression. And, the psychomotor retardation is more with just that real anhedonic, melancholic, like withdrawn type of depression.
And you can have both, right? You can kind of go back and forth, and you can also have them simultaneously in a sense. So, I have a lot of patients that will describe maybe their brain feels very agitated, right? But their body is very slowed down, or vice versa, right? So maybe their mind feels like a blank slate, but then their body, they're extremely restless, right? So it's not a simple either or. It can be a little bit more complex. And then how about the last symptom of depression?
So the last symptom has to do with suicidal thoughts, and we also could even include in there's thoughts that we'd be better off dead, basically. So basically, there's quite a continuum, with suicidal thoughts. And I think that's why it's really important for our listeners to understand that, a lot of people do have suicidal thoughts. That doesn't mean that they're going to go out and actually attempt suicide. Now, we always do take suicidal thoughts very seriously, and we need to explore that if somebody is having suicidal thoughts. But most people tend to have passive thoughts, where it just kind of intrudes in their mind. Oh man, this is just too hard. And almost a lot of people, to me, describe this escape fantasy, where they're like, okay, I don't know the way out, so this is maybe the only way out I can kind of think of. And so they have this fantasy of maybe being dead or something like that, but they don't really want to kill themselves. They're like, no, I want to get better, and I want to live, but I feel kind of stuck here. And so then that's where that can come in. Now, that's quite different in my mind to when someone crosses the line to start thinking about, oh, how would I actually carry that out? And what would the plan be to actually kill myself? And then maybe even toying with the idea of carrying that plan out. That starts to be very dangerous, and we need to really intervene at that point. And if someone actually has a plan, and of course, if they have an intent, especially to carry out that plan, then we really need to consider psychiatric hospitalization.
Yeah, and one thing that I do like to just assuage the fears of a lot of my patients. Many of them are fearful to admit to me that they have suicidal thoughts because they're always kind of anticipating that I might send them to the hospital.
That's true.
Right. And even though, yes, passive suicidal thoughts are very serious, in general, they don't warrant hospitalization. Right. It's when, as Dr. Binus said, you kind of cross that line when it switches over to intent and plan. And that's where if you have a family member that's expressing these types of things, you need to get them help ASAP.
Right. Absolutely. And I appreciate what you're saying there because, over 10 years now of being out of residency and practicing psychiatry, and I've dealt with hundreds of patients, I think I've only sent maybe like for suicidal ideation, maybe only a couple, maybe 2 or 3 to the psychiatric hospital.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazingly low because most people that are working with a psychiatrist, and if you have a good working relationship, you can often create a safety plan, especially by discussing with family and making sure that they're being monitored for safety, increasing the level of care, like for example, maybe to intensive outpatient care or partial hospitalization. So there's a lot of things that can be done to actually avoid inpatient hospitalization. So I agree. I think it's important that people actually talk to their mental health professional about it if you're having those thoughts, instead of like, oh, I don't want to go to the hospital. No, we need to discuss these things so that we can work through and actually help support the person through the crisis so that they can get better. And actually, studies actually do show that talking about the suicidal ideation does not increase the likelihood that someone's going to go out and commit suicide, because some people think, don't talk about it because that might make them do it. No, that's actually not true. And in my perspective, I think it actually helps tremendously, and it's a relief for patients and people in general to be able to talk about some of these things that they maybe haven't talked about with other people, so that they can work through it and feel like they have a safe place to talk about it and support and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, those were the 9 criteria associated with the diagnosis, according to the DSM, of major depression. However, there are a number of other symptoms that could also be a part of the clinical picture that may be important. So things like emotional numbness or apathy, a loss of motivation, general irritability, anger outbursts. Now, anger tends to be one of the more common symptoms in men and adolescents. So that's an important one, especially to be aware of. Now, crying spells, low self-esteem, even a loss of libido could be a sign of depression. And then also things like self-harm. So this would be things like cutting, burning, skin picking, hair pulling. These are just other symptoms to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are all important things to take note of. And I especially appreciate you pointing out, about the irritability with the adolescents and the men. It's just especially for guys, it's not as acceptable to be sad, and
Sure.
so oftentimes feelings of sadness, grief, depression get channeled into irritability, anger, and even for adolescents, they often have a sense of like, I don't know what's happening to me, and that just makes them upset, and then they can react in being irritable, and I don't know what's wrong, because like parents might be like, well, what's going on, and they don't know, they don't understand, and so it just makes them angry.
Sure. So moving on to the next topic, let's talk about prevalence, Dr. Binus.
Yeah. So when we talk about prevalence, the lifetime prevalence of major depression is around 20%. So that means,
can you say what that means?
Yeah. So that means about 1 in 5 people overall throughout their lifetime will develop major depression at some point in their life.
Okay. So that's them having at least one episode.
Right.
Right. So, if you've had multiple episodes, it doesn't necessarily change this particular percentage. Right. So 20% is, as you said, 1 in 5 individuals. And this is in the United States,
That's
I
right.
believe. Right.
So, yeah. And let's talk a little bit about the annual prevalence of major depression. So, Jonathan, maybe you can touch on that as far as our adult data.
Sure. So this is for 18 and older. This is from the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a very reputable research organization. And these stats that we're going to mention are from 2020. So in the United States, they estimated that 21 million individuals had at least one major depressive episode during the year 2020. Now, this represented about 8.4% of all U.S. adults.
So actually, that is quite a number, isn't it, when you really think about how many people are struggling with major depression. And in fact, it's interesting when you look at the global statistics, depression is actually the number one cause of disability in the whole world.
Yeah.
You'd think like, oh, maybe it would be cardiac disease or diabetes or cancer or something like that. It's actually not. The number one cause of disability, which goes back to, that loss of functioning, inability to really be functioning at a high level in your life, is actually depression.
So they did differentiate between just, something that would qualify as a major depressive episode, as well as a major depressive episode with severe impairment. And so, that level of severity is, this level is probably going to be sort of that classic can't get out of bed situation. Right. And this impacted 6% of the U.S. adult population. Now, depressive episodes were higher among females in 2020, which has been, that's pretty typical. But in this case, it was 10.5% compared to males, which was 6.2%. And of the adults, they did break they did break down the adults from 18 and above into multiple different categories. And the highest category, or the highest age range, was the 18 to 25s at 17%.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. And actually, in that context, let's talk about adolescents and just a couple stats from the adolescent age range, because to me, that's concerning, because we look at the younger age population. It's like, wow, that's actually quite a drastic difference there in the younger ages compared to, once you get into middle age.
So in 2020, it was estimated that between the ages of 12 to 17, 4.1 million adolescents had a major depressive episode. This represented about 17% of the U.S. population.
Wow. So, we were talking about adults, and overall that was about 8.4% of adults. But with adolescents,
17%
jumps
from
to
12
17%.
to
And again, if you look at the 18 to 25, that is right about the same, isn't it? About 17%.
Sure.
And so what we see is from the age of 12 all the way up to 25, about 17% of all adolescents, because that really encompasses the whole adolescent range.
And this even breaks down. So if you take 17% and you separate out the women, the women from the men, or I should say the girls from the boys, right? Girls were significantly higher, and overall in the adolescent range, it was 25.2%. So 1 in 4 girls between the ages of 12 to 17 had a depressive episode during the year 2020.
Wow. Yeah. And it makes me wonder too, if that's really accurate as far as I wonder if they're even catching all the boys, because again, I think boys, it tends to be more like irritability. And a lot of these boys, I think, end up in other buckets, like whether it's ADD or oppositional defiant disorder or whatever. But
sure.
But, any way you look at it, the stats are actually very concerning. Any thoughts about why that age range it has such big struggles?
I have a lot of thoughts, and that would be an entire podcast episode by itself, as I'm sure you do. And many of our listeners probably have some ideas as to what might be contributing. But, one thing, COVID lockdowns were not good for a lot of people in terms of socialization and their mental health, right? Yeah. We saw huge spikes, which we'll get into in just a second. But particularly, I think the people that were hit the hardest were adolescents. Mm-hmm. When schools being shut down, not being able to see their friends, not being able to see people smile, right? The overuse of technology, in households, a lot of these things really help to facilitate or exacerbate, especially, young girls who, tend to be more community based, if
Yeah,
you know what I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
right? They tend to need that socialization more so than your average, young boy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of COVID, any stats that you can share with us as far as some of the mental health issues that arose there?
Yeah, so these are global stats, so not just United States, but this is the entire world. And this study was published by the Lancet. And so they saw, with COVID-19, which to no surprise, there was a stark rise in both depressive and anxiety disorders in 2020. The overall number of cases of mental health disorders rose dramatically with an additional 53.2 million, and that's up from 193 million. So what is that? Sort of like a 20 to 25% increase over with depressive disorders, and then in anxiety disorders, an additional 76.2 million over about 300 million cases at baseline. So, so that was another significant jump. So kind of between both of them, just because of the pandemic, there was about a 20 to 25% increase overall in terms of number of total cases globally.
Absolutely. And I really am not at all surprised to hear that, especially there was one survey that they did, and this was just a survey and they weren't actually looking at diagnostic criteria for anything. But before COVID, they looked at basically people that had anxiety and depressive symptoms that were significant. And this was a United States household survey, and it was about 11%. And this was shortly before COVID in 2019. Then they looked at it during COVID, and that number actually jumped to 41%.
Mm.
So basically almost four times the amount. And we're not seeing four-time jump in diagnoses, but yeah, there's been obviously so many mental health issues that have come out of COVID.
So we talked about kind of one cause, particularly in adolescence, in terms of the lack of socialization as maybe one of the exacerbating factors of depression. But there's many theories behind what may cause depression. So, Dr. Binus, why don't we walk through a few of those, and we'll start with like the two most common ones, right? Most what everybody thinks about because it's been really ingrained kind of in our minds over the last number of decades. And so let's work through those.
Yeah, yeah. So this is not going to be an exhaustive list of causes because we'd be here all night. But but basically, we're going to touch on what we believe are some of the most important ones to hone in on. And so the one that most people think about is genetics. I think most everyone realizes there is a connection. If your parents are depressed, then there's a higher likelihood that you're going to be depressed.
Now, but higher, or I should say, how much of an increased likelihood is there, Dr. Binus?
Yeah, I think there's still some debate on that, but studies do show there is a significant increase, maybe even up to 40 to 50% higher prevalence. And how do they look at that? Well, they look at that with twin studies, identical twin studies, and they find that, okay, if you have the same genes, even if you're separated at birth, there is definitely a higher likelihood.
So that says two things. One is that there is a high likelihood that if you have a family member with depression, you might get it. But there's also about, in this case with a twin, 50 to 60% chance you may not end up with depression, right? So it also demonstrates that there's a lot of other factors at play other than just genetics. So what might be some of those other factors?
Yeah, and I just want to comment on that. I think that's a very important thing to hone in on, because some people really feel like, oh man, I have the genes and I just can't help but be depressed. And the good news is there are a lot of other modifying factors. And even if the gene for depression has been turned on, or the genes, because it's not just one gene, right? There are things that we can do, the choices we make, even the way we handle stress, exercise or no, nutrition, how's that actually help to determine whether those genes are turned on or off. And so, yeah, that really leads us to like, well, what are the other modifying factors here, right? And we talk about the other big kind of theory that has kind of been ingrained in people's minds is like, oh, it must be because I don't have enough serotonin or not enough dopamine. And what do we call that? Which hypothesis?
The monoamine hypothesis.
Yeah. What do you think about that one?
Well, there clearly is there's clearly some evidence behind it, right? And it's been useful to the pharmaceutical companies to have this as the predominating theory, because it means that, depression can be easily fixed by changing up the monoamines, aka the neurotransmitters, aka serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, right? So it's been useful from that standpoint, but if it was the only cause of depression, then these medications would be a lot more effective than they actually are.
It would cure 100%, right? Or close to it.
Sure. But we don't see that. And so it's far more complex. And, just like with most things in medicine, but particularly in psychiatry, most of these things are not very simple. And when we tend to oversimplify by sticking to, say, one theory, like we're generally missing the mark.
Absolutely. And, I think the bottom line is our bodies are the most complex thing in the world, right? And our brain is the most complex part of that body. And so to just oversimplify and say, oh, you just need a little more serotonin or it's not that simple. And yet, of course we keep trying to understand it better, but I think it's a constellation of things. And there's also hypotheses about inflammation or even mitochondrial dysfunction, right? And those are important hypotheses to think about, is like, okay, can inflammation affect our brain and our overall health and even maybe trigger depression? Yes. What about mitochondrial dysfunction, which mitochondria are the energy storehouses or powerhouses for our cells? Can that affect? Yes, it can potentially. But is that the only thing that will explain? No, usually it's a combination of factors.
So a couple other theories behind what might, cause or at least exacerbate some depressive symptoms are an individual's life events. So this could be particularly stressful events like traumas. These can definitely increase the likelihood of having a depressive episode. In a study that I pulled some numbers from, they said 75.6% of chronically depressed patients reported clinically significant histories of childhood trauma.
Wow.
So, it's extremely sad, kind of the nature of things, but it is an important thing to recognize.
Absolutely. And it really does show that it's, of course, not just the current stressors that we're facing, which also can contribute, especially if they're major stressors, but it also, those stressors that we experienced in the past can set the stage for mental illness and physical illness for that matter. And there's a lot of data in recent years that actually shows that.
So it's not just the stressors that you experience, but it's also your interpretation of the stressors, right?
Very
true. So the types of thoughts that you have about the things that you're experiencing or you have experienced, these can create what we call either cognitive distortion. So basically a distorted reality in your own mind that's not really in line with the true reality, right? And it can also create kind of this I guess system or series of sort of core beliefs that people can have that can really shape the way that they view themselves and others in the world.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today. And I think this was a good start in understanding some of the underlying factors. Again, that's not an exhaustive list. There's actually well over 100 causes, but the interesting thing is that you can lump those over 100 causes for depression into 10 broad categories. And we will have another podcast that really addresses that more explicitly. But again, the good news is there are things that we can do to modify a lot of these underlying issues, even our genes. We can't change our genes, but we can change how they're expressed. And like you said, you can't go back in time and change if we were maybe abused or something like that, but we can change how we relate to that experience in a healthier way. And that can actually keep us from being stuck in the past and in the trauma. So thank you, Jonathan, for being here and sharing. And thank you to our listeners for listening in.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.